Hey, welcome back to Introduction to Sociology with Dr. John. Today we're going to be illustrating the importance of symbolic interactionist theory by applying it to something which seems to be a macro issue. That is the baby boom that occurred in the United States after World War II. Now you may have heard of the baby boom. This was a period after World War II in which, for some reason, people simply decided to have more children. Now, it's, as I say, for some reason, because it's never been fully determined why social norms changed. But suddenly, from having just 2 or 3 children, people started to have 5 or 6 children in their families. As a result, the number of children grew, and of course, as they grew up, this meant a large pocket of young people supervised by a relatively small number of adults. So the question is, how did this, or what effect did this have on society? Were these large number of young people able to change the society they lived in? So here you can see the baby boom in 1964. The baby boom was accounted for this section of the population, those people who had been born from about 1945 up to about 1964 at that point. At that point, the baby boom slowed down or stopped. So as you can see here, the baby boom generation, that same generation of people, the number of children after that shrunk, and this is called the baby bust. But in any case, as you can see, there's a big bulge of people in this generation. As that bulge of people grew older, that meant you had a large number of people in that particular age group which were able to make demands in a certain sense. Well, let's see what happened. Let's start with something seemingly innocuous, blue jeans. And you might think blue jeans are innocuous, but look at this college classroom in 1950. Right? These are students who are pre-baby boom generation students, right? They are already young adults in 1950. So obviously they were born late 1930s, no, early 1930s. And you can see how formal the classroom is. Everybody's dressed up, everybody has a suit and tie. And those are the students, by the way, right? It's very male dominated. The one woman in the room is dressed as if she's going to a formal work engagement or something like that. So college here is seen as a time of conformity, when people are supposed to fit in and get ready for their future jobs in business. Now, blue jeans themselves are the opposite of this. They began in the 1870s as cheap pants for miners. Literally, the blue jeans were designed or created by Levi Strauss, who saw in San Francisco in the 1850s and 60s, all these ships came in carrying people for the gold mine, and the sailors would abandon the ships, so the ships would stay there. And these were sailing ships, so they had canvas sails. So he had this idea of buying up all the canvas, or maybe stealing it, I'm not sure, and making it into pants, trousers. Right? And these trousers he sold as extra durable because, of course, they're made of canvas. They became quite popular among the workers and the miners because they were very durable, they were cheap, and you'd never have to buy another pair in your whole life. So what happened is, because these were seen as workers' clothes, they were shunned by anybody who might go to college in the 1950s and 1940s. But in the 1960s, college atmosphere started to change, and college students not only became more relaxed, but it became more a time of resistance rather than a time of conformity. College students were a large group, and they started to throw their weight around. So one way of doing this, which began in very small groups, was to wear jeans to class, which originally would have been prohibited. Maybe they get kicked out of class. But if so many people start doing it, it becomes a norm. So by the 1960s, as you can see by this picture, this is actually 1970s, now we see almost everybody is wearing the ubiquitous blue jeans, or maybe some comfortable slacks. You also see a lot of women in the classroom, and you notice the women are also wearing jeans and no longer wearing a dress. So this change didn't happen because the social structure said, oh, now everybody needs to wear blue jeans. It changed because people at the local level simply started to change their behavior. And of course, part of it is related to broader patterns, of course. But the point symbolic interactionism is making is that you have to look at the symbolic process. In this case, jeans came to symbolize a form of resistance to the conformity of the classroom. Activism. So again, when you look at the 1940s and 1950s, college seen as a place of conformism. You look at colleges throughout American history, very rarely did college students ever protest or complain about anything, but suddenly in the 1960s, you have an explosion of activism. Of course, again, it was tied to bigger issues. A lot of the activism began with the African American civil rights movement. And this was started, again, because a lot of college students were now in colleges, and you also had very large African American colleges, particularly in the South. And this created a basis by which people could communicate about issues that concerned them. And so you create, again, the formation on the local level, beginning in interaction between people, taking on symbolism. So, for example, you take something like in this picture, where you see black students sitting at a counter, and a lot of white students are, as you can see, accosting them or attacking them. I don't know if you have seen something like this before, but this was called a sit-in. In the 1950s, or up until the 1960s, I should say, in most areas of America, if you were black, you could not sit at a lunch counter. The stores would tell you, no, you have to take your food to go. You cannot sit here. Or you have to pick up your food at the back of the store. In other words, any seating area was reserved for whites only. So black African American students started to question this, and they started to say, why are we paying the same amount of money? And I'm not saying they didn't question it before, but they couldn't do anything before. But now they started to see the possibility of forming a larger group. And again, this was very symbolic. The act of sitting down and saying, I'm not going to move. I'm just going to sit here until you give me my food. And of course, the stores that were stuck, well, the stores had two choices. They could either shut down the lunch counter or simply refuse to serve them, or they could serve them. If they served them, that would destroy the whole system, right? So this was developing passive resistance techniques that Gandhi had developed in India. I'm not going to go into all of these details. You're going to have to do some research for yourself. But the point is, by sitting down, they're making a symbolic protest. They're not fighting. They're not killing anybody. They're just sitting down. And of course, just like today, when people say, "How dare you kneel during the national anthem," or "How dare you march and insist on Black Lives Matter? This is ridiculous." Well, these are symbolic statements. And they weren't harming anybody or hurting anybody, but as you can see, the crowd is incensed. They would go in and they would pour food on these people and they would beat them up, and the store owners would just watch. The police would just watch. They would do nothing. If anything, they would arrest the black protesters because they were, quote unquote, sitting in the wrong place. Put it that way, they were trespassing. Right? Now the same thing then, of course, from the civil rights movement, you had the free speech movement, you had the anti-war movement, right? Again, a period in history, in American history, where millions of people went to the streets to protest a war, right? Something that had never really happened in the United States before. We'd had protests, but never on that level. The feminist movement. So all of these movements happened largely because there was a large group of people among the young people, and they were concentrated in colleges. It was relatively easy for them to organize. But what the point the symbolic interactions are making is they're using personal interaction and personal intervention using symbolism to make their point and get their point across. How successful were they? Well, there are no more segregated food counters in America. There are no more segregated buses. There are no more segregated or forcibly segregated schools. So I'm not saying that they have been 100% successful, but they certainly changed the structure of race relations in America. We'll talk more about the reality of race relations later on. And as a result, they had a huge impact on our culture and social structure. So imagine if you have a friend who is of a different race and you are walking down the street or going to a park or going to a restaurant or going to a movie theater 70 years ago, they would not let you both sit in the same area. They would not let you walk together. They would not like you to talk together. You would not be able to have that friend. So yes, it has had a huge impact on our culture. Clubbing, again, it may seem like an innocuous example. Clubbing, party. I'm not saying clubs didn't exist. You have clubs in the 20s, clubs in the 30s. But clubs became a huge phenomena in the late 60s, 70s, and 80s. We could also say drug culture became very popular. Again, I'm not saying these were new, but they became a much more massive phenomenon. You had new musical styles, so everything from, basically you had jazz music for about 50 years. Suddenly you had folk music, you had rock and roll, you had disco, you had punk rock, you had rap music, you had another half dozen genres of music coming out, all within this period between the 1960s essentially, or late 50s, and the early 1980s. You had a youth counterculture, you had a drug culture, the sexual revolution, or certainly a loosening of morality around sexual activity for unmarried couples, which was something that was taboo or seriously frowned on in the 1940s and 50s. Not that it didn't happen, but if you were an unwed mother in the 40s or the 50s or earlier, you would be shunned. You would be, if you were from a wealthy family, they would take you to another country to have an abortion or to have a child in another country and then bring it back and pretend it wasn't your child, because it was seen as such a taboo for somebody to have sex or, God forbid, a child out of wedlock. Gay rights, again, this is something that also came out of the 60s and 70s. And again, it was part of the club atmosphere. Gay people set up clubs, and these clubs were then attacked. And in defending themselves, they created the basis of the gay rights movement. So you might want to look up the story of Stonewall, in New York City, and of course the Castro Valley district in San Francisco. The point I'm making is that these were not part of a structural master plan, but simply because young people wanted to get together, and because there were so many of them, they had a huge impact on the dominant culture. I would add, you might disagree with me, that there has not been a single new significant musical style since rap and hip-hop music came out in 1980. And that's my generation. So today, you're basically all, you still have the same musical styles that my generation had 30 years ago. And believe me, if that had been true when I was 20, I would shoot myself. Just kidding. Deviants. So again, the very fact, all these social movements we talked about, clubbing, drugs, alcohol, sexuality, civil rights movements, protest movements, all of these themselves are forms of deviance. Again, the large numbers of young people, their interaction, created the potential to question the dominant system. Right? So rather than simply accepting what they were told by their elders, they would question it. In fact, there was a slogan that said, question anybody above 30. Another one was shoot anybody above 30. Right? Because the young people felt they were self-sufficient. They didn't need to be told anything by anybody. And the reality was, at the same time, there was also a massive increase in crime. Part of it related to increases of drug use, but you also had youth gangs. Again, I'm not saying these were new phenomena in themselves, but they became much more significant during this period of time. So you had a large amount of deviance, and crime rates shot up during the 1970s and 1980s. And subsequently, they've gone down because the baby boomers have grown up and are no longer committing crimes. Suburbia. So again, all these new people had to find a place to live. Now, suburbia was, the growth of the suburbs was aided a lot by government programs in ways people don't necessarily appreciate. For example, there was a massive program on the part of the government called the GI Bill that initially was just for veterans but later on expanded, that provided cheap mortgages so a lot of people could suddenly buy a house. And so they would want to buy a house in a new area with their own yard for the kids to play in. Now, of course, this also required roads and it required automobiles. So now you had everybody needing to have their own car so they can get back and forth to work. Right? So this created a whole new value structure. Again, not new, but influenced the growth of the value structure around the automobile. So the automobile became a new thing in a certain sense in the 1960s and 1970s. Everybody had to have a car, whereas before that, very few households as a rule had a car because most people lived in urban areas and you would just take the bus or maybe even just walk. Right? So very few people had a car. Very few people even owned their own home. Before the World War II, only 1/3 of Americans owned their own home. After World War II, or rather today, as a result of all these changes, now 2/3 of Americans own their own home. And that's largely because of these changes that took place again in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. Think about other things. These suburbs were designed to be residential, so they didn't allow stores. So you would have specially planned shopping zones, malls, and shopping centers for people to go to. And again, this creates a whole new culture. Rather than meeting people or getting to know people at the local store, you would meet all the neighbors, you would know everybody in town. Now people lived in a suburb, they drove back and forth to work, they drove back and forth to the supermarket maybe once or twice a week. They no longer necessarily knew anybody else in the neighborhood. In fact, neighborhoods were designed so you wouldn't necessarily meet anybody because you're always driving everywhere. And again, I'm not trying to exaggerate, but when you compare that with how people lived, or most people lived in the 1930s, most people lived in urban areas in what we would now call ghettos, basically, where you would know everybody on the street, and you would meet everybody at the corner store at some point or another. Right? Whereas in the suburbs, you created a sense of anonymity. At the same time, the inner cities, with all the middle class and wealthier people leaving, the inner cities became emptied out. And usually the poor people and the minorities would be stuck in the inner cities because minorities, they wouldn't let them buy a house in the new suburbs. Very often the new suburbs were for whites only, right? Or they simply didn't have enough money to buy a house. So this also created new patterns of racial inequality in America. Different races didn't live right next to each other anymore. They lived in entirely different neighborhoods. These create more job opportunities, create more housing, and government programs reacted to this. You had the GI Bill providing a lot more funding for colleges and housing, and this absorbed a lot of that demand from that baby boom generation. You also obviously had changes in industrial patterns and global change, trade that created a new prosperity in the United States. So people had more money as a whole, not just because of government programs, but because there was literally more jobs and more business in America. But these structural changes don't answer the central question of how the norms and values themselves changed. Right? So the symbolic interactionist argument is that when you look at norms and values, they have to change in actual implementation when they're being used. So you can't just see norms and values as something in the social structure. They have to be seen as something at the implementation level, at the ground level where people are using them. Now, of course, this is complicated by mass media, the internet, and of course we have many ways of interacting now that doesn't require face-to-face interaction. It may be interaction on the internet or interaction, the effect of the media. But again, symbolic interactionists would claim that this is all basically fundamentally comes down to changes happening because people are interacting. And then you have to look at who are the power players, or why does interaction push in one direction or another. In any case, I hope you enjoyed this debate. This is the end of our lecture today. And check the companion to any additional material before you take the quiz. All right?